Hey, everybody. Welcome into another episode of Can We Please Talk podcast. I am Mike Leon.
And you can also feel free to call me if you get lost. Shout out to Tyler, the creator. I'm Nick Severi.
Man, I want to snip that out so bad. All right. On the program today, Nick, my travel planner, and he's also the governor of my state, Ron DeSantis. He's got a fantastic trip plan for me and my family. More on that in a bit if you haven't been following the story of what Governor DeSantis has been doing, organizing flights for migrants. Organizing is a strong word. Plus, later on in the program, Anna Wolfe will be joining us from the MississippiToday.org. You can check out her work over there. She has done a fantastic job breaking this story about how former NFL quarterback Brett Favre worked directly with former Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant on redirecting welfare funds to build let me check my notes here, a volleyball stadium? Is that right? This incredible story, and the reporter who broke the story, Anna Wolfe, later on in the program. It's a crazy story. And shout out to her and the team over there for the reporting that they're doing on this. And we wanted to spotlight it because it should be getting more attention, excuse me, as my voice cracks there. Housekeeping notes, as always, October 27th. I've mentioned this a bunch of times on the program. Live show, Washington, D.C., City Tap House over in Penn Quarter. Come on down between 5 to 7 p.m. Mark it on your calendars right now. Take out your phone, mark it in your calendars. And speaking of taking out your phone, hit subscribe, follow the show, leave us a 5-star review and comment across audio podcast platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Nick, I've gotten some great feedback. I want to shout out the folks over at Good Pods that listen to the show. Jill, Mick, Vinny. We've gotten some comments from different people over on Good Pods that are listening to the different episodes. We've gotten, even in our first segment, we're going to talk about Governor Ron DeSantis, an immigration attorney, pinged us recently on some stuff that I'm going to read later on, but a lot of great feedback from different people about the program. How are you doing, my friend? I haven't talked to you in a few days. I haven't seen you on camera. We're not going to get into the Raiders. Don't even mention that. They stink. How are you doing?
Well, aside from our team in Las Vegas, I'm good. I'm good. We're just, as always, man, good here. Weather's great. Just election time is coming up. So my wife and I were talking about, are we going to do the mail-in? Am I going to go in person? We're kind of, getting that all squared away, as every person should be doing. So all good on our end in Pennsylvania. How are you all doing in Florida?
I'm good. Yeah, it's funny that you say that. We posted something on the show account that it was National Voter Registration Day the other day. So if you are not registered to vote, go register to vote. It takes a couple seconds. Go to your state website. I'm doing good, man. I mentioned about another housekeeping note. We had that docuseries. We started doing some prelim shooting on it. I want to shout out Florida International University, Dr. Jorge Dewani, that's down there in the Cuban Studies Department. We did a fantastic interview with him. We're going to play some of the snippets of that. And then I did some informal focus groups, talking to different voters, different people from within the Latino community, and also some other folks of different ethnicities and backgrounds throughout Miami. Just really talking about where they stand politically, ranking some issues in terms of importance to them. That'll be a part of this docuseries, but we're going to play some snippets as we get closer to the midterms, as we start to look really at what voters are paying attention to issue-wise and what matters. And there's some pretty good responses. One person that was a conservative, that his parents have been conservative his whole life, started to shift a little bit more moderate. And he explained why. We'll play that clip coming up. And I want to shout out all the people over there at FIU that were helping us as part of that shoot. It was a lot of fun. And speaking of Florida, I want to transition into our first segment because I mentioned this, Nick. If you need a travel agent, I think Ron DeSantis has a fantastic job, waiting in the wings if he doesn't win in November against Charlie Crist. If you haven't heard the issues that have happened over the last week or so with migrants that were flown on a flight to Martha's Vineyard that was all set up by the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis. Well, now the group of migrants, about 50 in total, have worked with a civil rights law firm to file a federal class action suit a couple of days ago against the governor for transporting them from San Antonio, Texas to Martha's Vineyard with a stop in between to Florida without shelter or resources in place. The firm is called Lawyers for Civil Rights in conjunction with the migrant-led nonprofit Alianza Americas. They filed the suit on behalf of these migrants because, as they told NPR, and I'm reading according to NPR right now, they were fraudulently induced to travel across state lines by DeSantis and the state of Florida. And the legal action obviously comes down, and this all took place last week. I want you to hear a little bit, Nick, from the attorney, Rachel Self, who was representing the migrants when they first got to Martha's Vineyard. This is what she said later that night after, being on the ground and talking to migrants and kind of setting up a statement for the public. Take a listen to this.
They were told there was a surprise present for them and that there would be jobs and housing awaiting for them when they arrived. This was obviously a sadistic lie. Not only did those responsible for this stunt know that there was no housing and no employment awaiting the migrants, they also very intentionally chose not to call ahead to any single office authority on Martha's Vineyard so that even the most basic human needs arrangements could be made.
So that was the attorney, like I mentioned, Rachel Self, that is working in conjunction with this group and Alianza Americas. Also, Governor DeSantis later on, hours after, this criminal investigation had been announced. Of course, where does he go for his outlet to tell his side of the story? If there is a side to tell, we'll get into that in a second. Governor DeSantis appeared on Sean Hannity's program, a show that I worked on once upon a time, over on Fox News. Take a listen to what the governor said in response to some of this.
Well, Sean, it's really frustrating because you've been covering this. Millions of people since Biden's been president illegally coming across the southern border. Did they freak out about that? No. You've had migrants die in the Rio Grande. You had 50 die in Texas in a trailer because they were being neglected. Was there a freak out about that? No, there wasn't. You've had criminal aliens get across that southern border and victimize Americans, killing some, raping some. Was there any type of outrage about that? No.
So you heard a little bit of the governor there, obviously hitting on a few buzzwords, blaming the president. Nick, we talked in our last episode with Texas Tribune political correspondent Patrick Svitek, and we were talking in the context of Governor Abbott doing this, right? And the busing of migrants. A little bit different situation there. And again, we've talked to Lauren Villagrán from the El Paso Times, and she mentioned this, right? Major transportation hubs. These migrants come into like an El Paso or places along the Texas border that are not big from a transportation standpoint. So the fact that he's busing them to DC or wherever it is, while it may seem political in nature, it is a way to get them to a transportation hub. Obviously, he should be busing them to Houston or Dallas, you can argue, right? Make it a shorter trip. But we know why he's doing this from a political standpoint. But regardless, whether they get bused there or not, it's still a major transportation hub where they can get to the city that they're supposed to go to as they await whatever they're awaiting in terms of a trial. But this is a little bit different because these were migrants that were not in the state of Florida. These were migrants that were in the state of Texas, and they were lied to by somebody representing the state of Florida, saying that there was, or maybe not representing the state of Florida, we'll find out as the facts come out, that said that get on these flights. There was a brochure that had been circulated that was verified from a political reporter that was able to uncover this. And the pamphlet really stated a bunch of different things that would happen once they got there. They were promised that they were going to go to Boston, not Martha's Vineyard. They were promised jobs, housing, similar to everything that the immigration attorney there, Rachel Self, said. And now we find out, like I said, these are not migrants from Florida. A large majority of them, by the way, Venezuelans, escaping everything that's happening there in Venezuela. And so they go from Texas, pit stop in Florida, with, I don't know why, maybe a refuel, and then to Martha's Vineyard, where they were left there and wandering around, no English spoken, right? Trying to figure out where they are. And then eventually a church there, Martha's Vineyard, was able to help out with housing and shelter while this was arranged. And then the local attorneys all descended upon there and started helping these folks get ready to, as Rachel Self there, I don't know if she said it in that clip, but a lot of these folks had hearings the next day, had to get to different places coming up, or else they were going to get sent back. What do you make of everything overall that not only I just said there, but what's happening to a lesser extent in Texas, because it hasn't involved chartered flights like this was from the state of Florida? But what do you make of everything that's happening, playing out with these migrants being redirected to places where Washington, D.C., Delaware, the home of the summer home of President Biden? These are places where, the officials that they are drawing the ire of are there. The migrants are being sent there. What do you make of all of this?
It's sad. Something I make of it is that it's not It's not unprecedented. Folks, I would direct you all over to NPR, who had shared a powerful story and then later had talked about on one of their programs about the reverse Freedom Riders. We're all familiar with the Freedom Riders, folks. They would come from the north down to the south to take up the battle for civil rights. In a turn in reverse of it, really mocking it, you had Southern lawyers, you had politicians who basically were lying to Black people about opportunities up north, particularly heading up in the 60s to meet John Kennedy and to have jobs available. If you head over to NPR, you'll see that story about one particular family, multiple children, and a mom who just wanted a better life for her family. Being told that getting up there, they'd meet the president, they'd have all, these amazing opportunities. And as you read it, I have it in front of me as I'm talking about this, it's very eerily similar to what this governor has done in Florida. I'll be honest, when I first heard about it, I'm not surprised. This has been the move by Republicans. This idea of let's move humans from one place to the other, just as a political football, to make some kind of warped statement about, I don't even know what about, because you're not valuing human lives when you do that. But in this particular case, what I didn't realize until reading the stories recently is now you have a governor of a different state going into another state to take people, lie to them, and then send them up somewhere to a Democratic area or a democratically led area. Well, what are we doing? Like, it's one thing if you want to be transparent and say, look, there's opportunities elsewhere. We'll get you there. That's one thing. I still have issues with it, like you gave about Texas. But to outright lie to people and then send media, or at least send a way of filming it, you have basically just made this into a sick cartoon. You're taking these people, you lie to them, you make sure you have all the photos and all the media captured to do what? To just pound your chest or touch yourself and say, look what I've done. I've owned the libs. You know what's especially offensive in the state of Florida, and Mike, you can speak of this more than I can, is you have doing this to Latin Americans in a state where you may currently, Republicans, have the majority of the Latino vote, which that number keeps changing. We saw this in 2020. What did you tell those people? That simply, well, these folks don't matter. They're less than. They're not really from here. But you, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, you're all fine. You're good people. But these folks from Venezuela, no, they didn't come in the right way. We're going to kick them up the Hyannis and make a statement. You think that's fine? You think that's fair to the diaspora? Like, again, I say this as a non-Latino person, but I can't even imagine what goes through your head when you read this in the paper and think the governor of your state is just kicking people around like it's nothing, and then goes on Fox News and has the audacity to say, well, they're bringing in rapists. You literally are pulling that from the Trump playbook. Like, to Americans, and I know 40% of you do still believe this bullshit. You honestly got to get your head examined. And I question anyone's humanity here. For a country that prides itself, majority speaking, on being a Christian nation, what we just saw is one of the most unchristian things you could possibly do.
Yeah. A couple of things there. First, I want to shout out the immigration attorney, Susan, who actually wrote into the show that actually said you guys should look into the reverse freedom rides of 1962. This has a racist historical context. You get into the race part, I hate playing that race card, but obviously you don't play it until that very end. I don't want to get into the race part of this because you've covered that ad nauseum there. And a great job by you, by the way. And Dr. Jorge Duani, who we did the interview with, I was alluding to him in the beginning. We talked a little bit about this, and some of the focus group studies I've done, immigration, to be honest with you, is maybe in the top 4, but it's not number 1. And for a lot of the people that I interviewed for these focus groups, they're Latino, and they come from either the Triangle Nations or they come from South America, where it's not necessarily as bad. Ecuador, Peru are not doing as bad as what's happening in Venezuela and the regime that's in control of Venezuela. But it was alarming to me that immigration wasn't as high as it should be, especially somewhere on visas and things like that. You would think, hey, priority level wise. But I'm dumbfounded, like you said, the humanity part of this, right? humanity part of this, the legality part of this. I want to know, is this illegal? Is the person who was representing either the state of Florida or maybe even Massachusetts and falsely, representing another state down in Texas, picking somebody up, taking them to another state? They took them to Florida, like I mentioned. This has been confirmed through flight logs and things like that. Took them to Florida before going to Martha's Vineyard. Where is that illegal? Because that's where I want to get to. The humanity part of it, you covered it. The race element part of this, obviously we know that huge undertone there. But is this illegal? I want to get to that. I want to see where the story plays out. Funny you mentioned NPR. Next episode, Jimena Bustillo will be joining us, the political reporter at NPR that's been covering this. She was actually awaiting in Delaware for another flight that was supposed to be chartered by Governor DeSantis of more migrants that were going to be sent to where President Biden obviously has his vacation home. So more on that in the next episode. We'll get into that with Jimena. But for this episode, when we come back after the break, I alluded to her earlier on. Anna Wolfe will be joining us, broke this great story about Brett Favre and what he has been doing to redirect welfare funds that were supposed to go to the poorest individuals in the state of Mississippi, all for a volleyball stadium for his daughter that goes to Southern Miss. Anna Wolfe when we come back after the break. Quick break here. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you could see my screen here. Fresh Roasted Coffee since 2009. This Pennsylvania company has been delivering fresh roasted coffee. You can check out their website at freshroastedcoffee.com or shop them online through a bunch of different places. I'll read you something here. Nick, they roast the freshest coffee beans using the most eco-friendly roasting technology on earth. I happen to have a cup right here.
Break here.
Coffee. We are presented, as always, by Fresh Roasted Coffee. If you can see my screen, why don't you tell the people why Fresh Roasted Coffee head on down to freshroastedcoffee.com and buy some of this amazing coffee.
First, Mike, let's talk about flavors. If you are a single origin kind of person like you and myself, they've got you. If you are a flavor person, they've got you as well. Flavor packs, individual items as well. And it's not just coffee, folks. You can also get tea. My wife's a tea drinker, so freshroastedcoffee.com's got her too. But more importantly, you can learn about the coffee. When you get to the website, there's a quiz that tells you what's the coffee that's best for you. Sumatra is my blend, and they got that one right. I can tell you that for sure. They'll do the same for you when you head over to the website.
freshroastedcoffee.com. Go to our episode description right now. There's a link right there, and at checkout, you're going to get a discount for this amazing tasting coffee. Head to freshroastedcoffee.com today. And now back to the show. Anna Wolfe is joining us here. She's an investigative journalist over at MississippiToday.org. She has been covering this entire Brett Favre story. She broke this story, and we are so excited to have her join us here on the podcast. Mike Leon, Nick Saveri. Anna, thank you so much for hopping on with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, Anna, I was telling you off air a little bit about how I work in the sports realm. Obviously, Nick and I are both sports fans. Brett Favre is a legendary figure, not only in the National Football League, but obviously in the Mississippi community. Obviously, he went to Southern Miss, and we all know about his accolades in that state. But this story, I think, has flown a little bit under the national radar in terms of what has taken place here, welfare funds that were redirected. At a 30,000-foot view, can you take our audience into the great reporting that you've done to break this story? How did this story come about, and how did it land on your desk and you ultimately reporting on it?
Sure. So, my experience with the welfare program, that's the program that was targeted in this scheme to misspend federal funds. It's called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. I got really interested in this program when I started the Poverty Beat at Mississippi Today. I knew that this federal fund was a very flexible, states could spend the money in very broad ways to tackle poverty. So I knew that I could look to this fund to kind of get an indication for how the state is tackling poverty in Mississippi. And so I started looking into this fund, trying to get information about how the money was spent. And I just hit roadblock after roadblock, attempting to get information from the Department of Human Services, which is the state agency that administers these funds. Fast forward a couple years after I started looking into the program, the auditor's office arrested 6 people related to a scheme to embezzle 4 million of these federal dollars, temporary assistance for needy families dollars. And one of the companies that received 2 million in those stolen funds was called Prevacus. It was a pharmaceutical startup company that was developing a drug to treat concussions. And so pretty early on, I was able to tie Brett Favre to this, overall welfare scheme, because he was the one pushing that company. He was representing that company, trying to get the state to invest in that company. And then after that, we learned that a volleyball stadium had been purchased with $5 million in welfare money. And then over the last 2 years, we've kind of just learned more and more about Brett Favre's involvement and just how much influence he had over the officials who were allocating these funds. And that kind of leads us to where we are today.
Nick, you're on mute.
Thank you for catching that. Anna, from everything you've seen in your reporting, there's a lot of hurdles and a lot of channels that we're going through to get to where the story is, but also the actions of a former NFL player. How do you make sense of all these steps taken to support, while famous and important in the state, but essentially a former athlete? What do you make of that, and what have you seen in your reporting that just sort of breaks that all down?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting from the very beginning. Again, we were able to see that this company that was listed in the indictments was a company that Brett Favre was backing, but he wasn't the only athlete involved here. So we learned pretty early on that Marcus Dupree, if you've seen the 30 for 30 best there never was, Marcus Dupree, football player Paul Lacoste, and these wrestlers, these former WWE wrestlers, Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, and his sons, were also involved in the welfare program and, received funds that were supposed to go to Mississippi's neediest residents. And, I think it's just an example of how Mississippi exalts celebrity and exalts athletes. Here, we're sort of 50th in everything good. But one thing we do really well is we produce a lot of great athletes. And I think you saw those priorities kind of come through and how our welfare funds were spent. But it all goes back to how flexible these funds are and how states are really allowed by the federal government to use them however they wish. And so when you think about, like, why would Brett Favre be involved in the state's welfare program, or why would public officials be interested in funneling money to a character like Brett Favre? I think that the money was just there, for the picking. So when Brett Favre came to them with these proposals of things he wanted to see funded, it was kind of a no-brainer. Here's a pot of money that we can manipulate for our purposes.
Anna, from your reporting about the Department of Human Services, it seemed as though that, like other divisions and departments in all this, that they're being used essentially by politicians as a way to help to justify expenditures. Is it safe to say that in that case that the Department of Human Services was almost acting as a front or being used just erroneously by state officials?
Yeah, that's a kind of a good way to put it. With this all of this money that was misspent, or almost all of it, flowed through a nonprofit or two nonprofits that were running a program called Families First for Mississippi. So what they did was, instead of sending out the grants, these TANF, temporary assistance for needy families grants, to nonprofits that provide direct services to people in poverty, energy assistance, food assistance, childcare, these kinds of things, they sent it to these two organizations that essentially became a black hole for this money, and they weren't reporting any of those expenditures back to the Department of Human Services. So again, going back to where I was saying that I was trying to get information from the department about how this money was spent, well, all the money was being spent by these two nonprofits, and none of that information was then going back to the department. So it was a pretty coordinated, like orchestrated scheme to conceal where this money was going by funneling it through nonprofits that weren't reporting any of that information.
So Anna, let me ask you, on staying on that front, because from your reporting, I read something I want to quote from your report. You said, and this was about Nancy New, nonprofit leaders had misspent at least 77 million in funds that were supposed to help the needy. Forensic auditors found New pleaded guilty to 13 felony counts related to the scheme. And Davis awaits trial. That's another person that's involved in this. And then neither Bryant, which was the former governor, or nor Favre have been charged with any crime. I think anybody listening to this, watching this, any realist says, hey, what's going on here? Is there a crime? In your reporting, have you talked to any legal experts? What actual charges could come from this?
That's a really good question, because there is a distinction between, something that's a crime like embezzlement or fraud, wire fraud or conspiracy, and then just misspending or government mismanagement, right? And so I think you kind of have to look at each expenditure that happened to determine, on a case-by-case basis, like which bucket that falls into. And so, the $1 million payment that went to Brett Favre to deliver speeches and cut advertisements for the welfare program, for example, has not resulted in a criminal charge, but it is resulted in civil charges against Brett Favre. Again, that's not a crime, but it is a civil charge where he's being asked to give back that money. And he's also being charged with another payment that he hasn't paid back yet. He has repaid the $1 million to the state. Anyway, I think, your question is going to be answered by grand juries when the time comes within this ongoing FBI investigation to determine, which players here, depending on their involvement, whether they committed a crime or not. But, the big purchase, I think, that has made the headlines here recently is the $5 million that went to the volleyball stadium. And someone in this scheme, namely Nancy New's son, has already pled guilty to defrauding the government by funneling that money to the volleyball stadium and disguising it as a lease to get around federal regulations. So the crime there wasn't just putting the money into something that it shouldn't have gone to. It was disguising the purpose of the payment because they said that the nonprofit was going to use the volleyball facility to provide programming to people in poverty. That's how they got around the regulations and the prohibition on using TANF for construction. And that was the crime, right? It's almost like the cover up is worse than the crime, sometimes they say. So in that plea agreement, he has admitted to defrauding the government. And in that document, it says that he worked with others, unnamed others. And so we're waiting to see if prosecutors are going to hold those folks accountable.
And one of the most recent things you'd put out was the release of text messages that we saw between Favre and some of the other associates in this matter. What are some other, and that felt at the time, that feels still at the time, the most damning piece of evidence. Favre's asking, is the media going to find out how this is all happening? In your reporting, what are some of the other just damning piece of evidence, that things that just come to light? Because you've had to do a ton of reporting and digging to bring those to surface.
Yeah, I think the communication has been huge. Up to this point, before about 6 months ago, we didn't have direct communication, candid messages between these officials in order to kind of shed some light on what their mentality was around spending these dollars. So, these text messages that just came out last week have really captivated the national attention, but there were text messages that I obtained and published back in April that showed that Brett Favre was actually offering the governor stock in that company that I mentioned, Prevacus, that he was offering the governor stock in exchange for his help. And then in the last year of Phil Bryant's administration, his time as governor, he discussed this project. He discussed the progress. He was briefed when money started going to the company. And then about a month before he left office, they said, we want to bring you on with ownership now. What can we do? And he said that he couldn't take a company package until he left office. And then 2 days after he left office, in text messages that I obtained, he agreed by text to accept stock in that company that received $2 million in stolen welfare funds. I mean, I think that's kind of one of the more extraordinary stories that's come out of all of this. And it really hasn't, risen to the level of the national attention that the volleyball stadium has.
And in addition to the work you're doing as a journalist, you can't help but wonder as a citizen of the state of Mississippi, and I happen to live in Pennsylvania, and Mike happens to live in Florida, but as citizens trying to be more informed, because you began the story with the pursuit of understanding TANF and really how is the money being spent, as an informed citizen and journalist should do. But to ordinary citizens like us or anyone in Mississippi at this point, what are some steps we can all take to try to be mindful, and as those kinds of questions come up for us as taxpayers, to be more vigilant about holding our officials accountable beyond the vote?
I think that's a great question. One of the ways that I was able to kind of hone in on this story was just looking at what the state advertised and what these nonprofits advertised to, doing. And so we see this stuff all the time. Like, average people can see advertising on social media, or, you go to a sports event and there's a booth, right, of a nonprofit offering services. So I think just like being more mindful, more aware of what, what kinds of programming is being offered out there, or what kinds of services these nonprofits are purporting to administer, and then just keeping our eyes open and like actually asking for the proof, or like, if you care about this population that I'm talking about, the low income population, and that there's a nonprofit that's doing work in this space, like go to their storefront, or go to where they're saying that they are offering services, offer to volunteer and actually put eyes on what they're doing. I don't know if you guys saw the story out of, I think it was Minnesota. I just saw the story yesterday about $250 million worth of pandemic relief in the food assistance area, stolen, fraudulently taken from this program. And they were reporting wild things. They were saying that they were serving, one guy said he was serving 5,000 kids a day from a 2-story apartment complex, and raked in millions and millions to benefit himself by reporting things that he wasn't doing. And so I think that seems like not very sophisticated. It seems like some people with, keeping their eyes open could probably tell that was going on.
And I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question in the way I'm going to ask it. And I'm saying this as somebody who has been on welfare. When typically we talk about welfare, there's a racial tone to it sometimes, obviously.
Absolutely.
Here we have a wealthy white person more or less abusing the system in a way that may accuse Black people of doing this. Anna, are you satisfied, as you've been making the media rounds lately, are you satisfied on the level of coverage this story is getting beyond your outlet that covers it at the local?
Am I satisfied with the way that it's been discussed?
Correct. In terms of, prominent white athlete that's stealing money from poor people that should be distributed to poor people, have you seen the same level of coverage that the national media can easily spotlight on this and probably fast track this if there are any, anything illegal that's been done that can start to get looked at, right? We all know the power of the national media when they parachute in on situations like this. As you've been making the rounds, are you satisfied with the level of coverage that you're seeing attributed to this?
I have been pretty pleased with the way that the national media has sort of tackled this story right now. I've gotten many interview requests, and there's a lot of attention on the story. I am sort of saddened by the fact that it took this name of this athlete, Brett Favre, in order for that national attention to come. I don't know if the story would be getting told nationally right now if it weren't for the involvement of someone like Brett Favre and other athletes that we've seen, whose names have been in the news. But the effect on people in poverty in Mississippi is the same, regardless if the money went to Brett Favre or some other, political crony or family member of a politician that might not, capture the national audience. The money wasn't going to people in need. That wasn't happening. And that is the real story here, not necessarily, Brett Favre or any other individual. The fact is that in Mississippi, we prioritize this idea that people in poverty, our leaders really, they push this idea that people in poverty are there because of them, and people in poverty are, it's their fault that they're there. And we spend the money in ways that perpetuate this idea that, people in poverty just need a pep talk from Brett Favre in order to escape poverty, instead of looking at evidence-based practices for interrupting generational poverty, which is the primary issue here in Mississippi. I don't know if that answers your question, but
no. Well, let me follow up on that, because you are doing fantastic work on this and covering this. And like you said, if it wasn't for Brett Favre, maybe it doesn't get the attention. But I want to spotlight the organization that you work at, MississippiToday.org. Tell us a little bit about, obviously, investigative journalism. We know you guys can cover. Tell us a little bit about the org and the aims of the organization.
Sure. So Mississippi Today is a nonprofit, all online news organization. We operate mainly based on, grants, foundational support, and donations. And we just started back in 2016. And I think, our kind of main focus is nonpartisan, down the line, straight news, but also bringing in additional context. So not just your quick hit news, but trying to be as contextual as possible in our storytelling. Like I said, we started in 2016, and I started in 2018, and I really sort of came to Mississippi Today and said, there is not a poverty reporter in the state of Mississippi. There's no reporter whose beat is specifically reporting on poverty. Please hire me and allow me to write about this topic. And the first thing that I did when I started at Mississippi Today was sort of sit on the floor in my office and spread out these TANF reports, these federal reports that showed how we were spending TANF money, or at least, how they said that they were. And that is sort of how this all spawned. This is what spawned from it. So that's what we try to do. And we're also totally free, and we allow other publications to publish our work. So you can see our articles in a number of local papers, because we allow them to publish kind of like a wire service. So that's really our mission, is to, provide that as a resource to people.
Well, you're doing a great job covering this story and all the breaking news surrounding it. You can check out MississippiToday.org and all the great work that Anna Wolfe and her colleagues are doing over there. Follow her on social media as well. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the program today. Continued success to you, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much.
Our thank yous there to Anna Wolfe. Like I mentioned, MississippiToday.org. You can check out all the work that her and her colleagues are doing over there. This has been a crazy story. She's been following this story for a while. The former governor is Phil Bryant. So obviously, if you're thinking, well, isn't Tate Reeves the governor right now? He's not involved in this. The former governor was the one that helped Brett Favre secure this welfare funding for the University of Southern Miss volleyball stadium. And a lot of this was found, like she mentioned, not only combing some of these reports, but also she was able to obtain the text messages and the exchange. If you don't know, Brett Favre's daughter obviously goes to Southern Miss. He's obviously an alum as well and played quarterback there. So if you're thinking, why was he funding it to the University of Southern Mississippi? There's your answer. Nick, on a high level, high surface level, my takes real quick on this. Prominent athlete Brett Favre has kind of been in hot water for other text messages to another person, another female, in a different way. You can check out that story online. I'm not going to go into that right now for those of you that don't know it. But I've been seeing different shows covering this. I've seen Anna, from NBC. She was on the Lebertard show recently as part of Meadowlark Media, excuse me. We invited her on because I think we spotlight local journalism, but then there's stories like this, like at the local level, this really affects everything happening in the state. She mentioned it. Mississippi ranks in the bottom, not only from education, health care. We see what's playing out with the Jackson water crisis. We see the insensitive comments that the governor made, joking about his largest state, right? The state capital. There's just a lot going on in Mississippi, and her organization is doing a great job of spotlighting that and letting other publications, like she said, run with the stories. But for her to break this news, I agree with her what she said there. I don't think it gets the attention if it's not Brett Favre, if it's not the face of Wrangler jeans. We've all seen the commercial of him throwing a pass in Wrangler jeans. By the way, nobody plays football in jeans, Brett. But like, there's a lot there, but there should be more of an emphasis from other media orgs. We've seen now prominent black athletes, Shannon Sharp and Terrell Owens, come to mind specifically, that are like, why aren't we talking about this more? This guy, for lack of a better term, embezzled or worked with, in conjunction with somebody else, to embezzle money that was going to poor people, to help poor people through these programs. And he redirected it for a volleyball stadium for his daughter at his alma mater. I don't know if it's illegal, because I'm not a lawyer, neither are you. I can't speak to the legalities of it, but I will say on the surface, it's horrible. And I don't see the attention being devoted to it. And the reason why we wanted to include it in a segment here. Give me some of your overall takeaways as we sign off for the people here.
It's funny. I'm reminded because, Anna tells us the story that she began this, studying TANF in terms of, funding for needy families, right? She's sitting on the floor just looking at all these different reports, and she basically does what, for any fan of The Wire, particularly of the character Lester Freeman, did. She followed the money. On the show, Lester, of course, was quoted as saying, if you follow drugs, you end up with drug dealers. But you follow the money, and you don't know where the hell it's going to take you.
Right.
That's exactly what happened here. The question began with, how are we spending this money? Federal money comes into a state. This happens with any state, right? Pennsylvania, Florida as well. And then you ask yourself as a journalist, are we tracking this? And one thing Anna's doing is she's just simply asking, as an informed citizen, as a journalist, what is this all being done on the up and up? If this is for needy families, is it truly getting there? That's where this began. In her reporting, she finds out the answer is no. And to what other former athletes are saying, that's absolutely true. Because I remember for sure, at the time of Michael Vick's situation involving dogfighting, and he's guilty, obviously, and he's done his penance, he did his time. Mike, when that story broke, we saw every outlet in America outraged. All over the country, people were angry about this. Friends of mine who are dog owners to this day, who are also sports fans, cannot stand Michael Vick, have the most nastiest things of saying about him. All of it warranted. This is a horrible thing to have done to animals. We're only, I feel, only a couple of weeks into the cycle, only a couple of days into this cycle. That story about the text messages is only fairly recent. But I'm not seeing that same level of anger. And this particularly is insulting because historically, when we think about welfare, as you brought up in the interview, we do tend to think about people of color. Particularly, we tend to think of Black people. And that, by the way, fans of history of this show, we can remember this with the Reagan administration. The Reagan campaign in the 80s put forward the idea of welfare queens, this visual of Black women that we said, they're the ones using the system and all this horrible racist rhetoric. And here's a guy who literally used the system to his benefit. And the story is there. The work that's being done in Mississippi today is vital to this. And we're going to get into the benefits of local journalism in a minute. But yeah, Mike, I'm with you. I'm not seeing this. I'm not seeing this plastered all over ESPN. I'm not seeing this plastered all over all the networks as we did with the case of dogfighting. And I do have to ask the question, why is that? Because this seems seismically at a bigger level, and it's certainly affecting human beings at a more direct level in the form of people who are looking forward to, who need this money, having it not available to them because a person with enough money wants to go use public funds to build a volleyball stadium.
Right. Say that sentence out loud. All you got to do is say a sentence out loud and you realize that's wrong. Building a volleyball stadium or redirecting funds that are supposed to go to needy folks. We have to leave it there. Check out, like I said, MississippiToday.org if you want to read all the stories that Anna and the team have been doing over there covering this. Follow her on social media over on Twitter. She's a great follow now, covering all of this and breaking this. Speaking of Twitter, social media, IG, TikTok, Twitter, you can follow us at Can We Please Talk Podcast, on Twitter at Can We Please Talk. YouTube channel, you want to watch the video of this interview and all the interviews we've done on this program, head to Can We Please Talk podcast on YouTube. You can type that in. We should come right up and hit subscribe for us there. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do it without them. And we can't do it without each and every one of you. I thank you each and every week. I mean it from the bottom of my heart. You listen, you watch, good, bad, or indifferent on the comments. I can't thank you enough. As always, I am Mike Leon.
And a proud supporter of local journalism, as well as you all should be too. I'm Nick Severi.
We'll see everybody next time. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.